Hi everybody! It is another What We Read video.
That's right,
to
here
talk
we go.
about all the books we read. I don't know when.
So far abouts. That's a pretty vague but
way.
accurate time frame.
I think so too. I think so too.
All right, so let's get
I'm
right
gonna
into
kick
it.
things off by talking about a book called Bring Me Their Hearts by Sarah Wolf. This is a
Awesome.
recommendation from my friend Kristen, Merrily Kristen. She told me to read this a while ago, and I finally got around to reading it now.
Hey.
It's about a young woman named Zara who, in this world, she is a heartless, which means that a witch holds her heart captive.
That's terrible.
And she basically serves the witch's bidding.
Sure.
Sometimes these witches are good witches, and like sometimes they're not, and so the treatment that the heartless gets depends on that. Zara is given a mission, and the thing she stands to gain from completing it is that she can get her heart back. The mission is that she needs to get close to the prince of the country that they live in, because the royal family is dead set on like ridding the world of witches.
Sure.
So she needs to get close to the prince, and she needs to take his heart so that he'll be subservient to a witch. Except that when she meets the prince, he's not quite what she expects. Things kind of go from there.
He takes her heart instead.
I thought this story was really fun. I think that the world and the way that the Heartless were set up in it, that was really interesting to me, because I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it. So lore-wise, this was something that felt refreshing to me, even though it does have a lot of like typical hallmarks of like a fairy tale, you know.
Yeah.
It also was fun that Zara was pretty snarky and sarcastic. She's a sass monster basically.
Lovely.
And she is like that the entire book. Sometimes it got to the point where I felt it was a little contrived, but like I still enjoyed it because that sense of humor just appeals to me greatly.
Sometimes when somebody takes your heart, you do tend to get sassy.
I will say the beginning and the ending are probably the parts that I enjoyed the most, because there is a part, like there's a very long section in the middle where it doesn't feel like a lot is happening, even though things are happening.
That's fair.
It took me a longer time to read than I expected, just because of that big lull in the middle.
Sure.
However, by the time I got to the end and I got to how it was going to end, I was like, huh, I might have to keep going because I do want to know what happens next. So I think the author did a great job bringing like a unique world to life, giving you an interesting enough story, I should say, and also giving you characters that you could root for.
Yep.
Specifically Zara, who is kind of a hoot, and also sometimes you're like, really, you have time to be sassy right now?
And yet here we are.
And yet here we are. So I'm glad Kristen recommended that one. I don't know when I'll read the next one, but I'm pretty sure I'm gonna have to, just to find out what happens next. The next book that I'm gonna talk about is also one that I read partly because of Kristen, because she had read it literally a month before I decided to request it at the library, but also my friend Monica from It's Monica Kim also read this and raved about it. It's called If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha, and it is about 4 young women who live in South Korea, contemporary South Korea, and their lives, basically. We have an ordinary office worker, we have someone who works in sort of like a cafe, catering to, there's someone who's like an artist, like they have a whole bunch of different careers, but it's an exploration of their lives, how societal circumstances can dictate your place in Korean society, how Korean standards of beauty can also contribute to that, the different sort of aspirational goals that someone in their positions might have, and it was fascinating. It was one of those things where like I was rooting for all of these women because in different ways they were underdogs to their situation, and I love an underdog, and I always want the underdog to succeed. So it was really interesting just to see how this author portrays their story. It's not the kind of story where you get like an ending, like a solid ending. This is a slice of life, so you're basically getting a solid portion of their lives, how those lives intertwine between the 4 women, and how they also have their very individual goals and desires. And it's just fascinating. I've always found it interesting to read stories that explore circumstances and people's lives that are very different from my own, and this is definitely that. It does get very heartbreaking because there are a lot of things that these women put themselves through or have to go through because of their place in society, and that was really sad to read about. But it was also hard to tear your eyes away from it because you kind of wanted to know like how this would snowball and what would happen next. I just thought it was really interesting, and I think the author did a great job telling the story the way she did, how she alternated between all of them, how it's funny because at first I was like, oh, I think I only like these 2 characters, and then by the end of it I'm like, no, I actually like all of them, just because I want them all to get what they want, basically. Yeah, totally. Even though some of the things they did, I was like, oh, you're making a choice there. Not a choice that I would recommend making, but like, I get why you had to make that choice, you know? So, found it very interesting. I'm glad I finally picked that one up to read. The Library Book by Susan Orlean. This is a book that starts off with the fire at the LA Public Library years ago as the inciting incident, and it sort of explores that case, but also explores how libraries play a significant and important role in the lives of many people, both in LA specifically, but also like in general. Lovely. And I appreciated listening to this one because I had no idea about that huge fire at the LA Public Library, the circumstances of it, and like how bad it actually was, and listening to it was so heartbreaking. Like, as someone who loves books but also someone who appreciates libraries and librarians, it was so sad just to hear, you know, what happened to everyone after that, and like how much damage was caused and how much was lost because of it.
It's terrible.
It was horrible. But it was also nice just to get a reminder of like how important libraries can be, what sort of function they serve. They're not just a place where you can, you know, get books to read or, you know, find information you need for school or stuff like that. It's also places of community. It's places that can be support systems for people. And that, to me, was the great part about reading this story or like listening to it. I did have to take a minute to sort of get really into the story because the way that it's written is a bit drier than I would normally like in my nonfiction. I don't think this is true of everyone else who's read it, because I think a lot of people have read and like this. And while I did like it, it did take me a little while before I really got hooked onto the way it was narrated and the information that was being given to me. And even when I finished it, I was like, it was good to learn about this, but it's also not one that's going to stick around in my memory. I am glad I read it. I do think that it just, you know, re-emphasized my love for and appreciation for libraries and librarians. It was a worthwhile nonfiction read, though I do not think it is the kind of nonfiction that would stick around, for me at least, long term in my memory.
Fair. All right, my turn. I went on a really dark anime binge. Well, actually dark manga kind of binge. And I'm gonna start off with something by Inio Asano. Inio Asano had written something that I love called Solanin, which is about a young girl sort of like who's got a band. And it was very slice of life, very what do I do, very coming of age. And I thought, oh, another one. Let's see what you've got. Not this one. This one is called Nijigahara Photograph. Yeah, it's heavy. It's heavy. There's like, the themes here are like murder and abuse, and it's like this Love Actually type deal where you have several like threads and several perspectives that sort of come together around the death of one particular girl, and then throw in some timey-wimey if-then kind of vibe, and almost like Closer even, or I don't know, where you've got different timelines of what could have happened, what should have happened here and there. So if you're not following too closely, you could sort of get confused if you're reading casually. I personally admire the skill with which sort of this piece was put together, because it really does feel like it's even like I remember like my old Japanese film classes that I attended in college, where you know, you've got like Rashomon where it's like told from several perspectives, and but you've got also that Ozu type, you know, it's happening every day and the sunlight falls at a certain angle, but also people get murdered, and you know, it's crazy, and it rocks sort of like the lives of everybody in this small town. So it sounds sensational, but when you're reading it, it's almost so subtly like grim and very, very sort of heart-wrenching. And you almost, and again, if you're just reading casually, the shifts between timelines of what could have happened, what should have happened, and what actually did happen tend to get whiplashy a little bit if you're reading casually. But if you engage and you sort of, you know, which I sort of tried to do towards the middle, I'm like, oh, I can't just do this sitting down. I gotta hunker down and really work this thing through. It turns out to be a pretty decent, well-written sort of like piece, and Inio Asano just keeps his clout, I guess, of why he's, you know, like all of the accolade, like that's well-deserved. Is it for everybody? No. No. It's nigh graphic, but it's enough, but it's graphic enough that it might even heighten the tragedies of what's happening, than as opposed to you see something outrightly gory or outrightly like obscene or outrightly whatever. So there's that. Clearly that set me on a path, and I found
clearly that set me on a path.
And I found Shuzo Oshimi's work. Let's start with The Flowers of Evil. If that's familiar to some of you, maybe it's because it is sort of based on the Baudelaire sort of like piece that the book called The Flowers of Evil, and the young boy sort of in the story, also set in high school, just like with, you know, Nijigahara Photograph, is a Baudelaire reader, and he just has sucked in all of that aesthetic.
Okay.
And you know, he has a crush on this one girl like in class, which is sort of like but this new girl kind of moves to town, and she's kind of like got this anarchist, nihilistic kind of like view and take on life. And so it's almost very Cruel Intentions how these two end up having this terribly abusive relationship. because he ends up and the exciting incident is he ends up getting his hands on like the girl, his crush's physical education sort of like uniform. Which is very intimate, right? Because Japanese phys ed sort of uniforms, sometimes like they're a little skimpy and then it's just whatever. And so that's a big deal. And then people are wondering who's the perv that stole it. And they sort of just egging each other on. It's a lot of emotional blackmail. It's a lot of like manipulation and emotion. It's just super, it's like a bunch of high school kids. And then this girl who sort of gets rope-a-doped into it, right? Starts to play ball. And she's got her own agenda. And now there's three of them sort of like butting heads and running around each other, and it's not a feel-good thing. Is it for everyone? I don't even think it's for most people. It's a small niche audience who just sort of loves this kind of thing, so I had to know how the heck it would resolve. That's the only reason I sort of binged the entire thing. It ends just about as well as it started. Which is to say, what you get, in terms of the experience, there's very little to look forward to. What you see is pretty much what you get. It's just what is the domino effect of this terrible set of dominoes that you set up. On that note, it's consistent. If you like that, cool. If you're waiting for a twist, there are some, but I don't know if it's the twist that you want. So I thought, all right, let's give it one more shot. Another one of his works. So this one is called, interestingly enough, Happiness. And this one's really obscure. This is vampires.
Okay.
And it's about a young boy who gets, bitten by a vampire. The vampire is female. She doesn't let him die. She actually says, "Would you like to be like me?" And he starts to struggle every day with vampirism, and it starts off kind of like that. Am I going to be a vampire? Am I not going to be a vampire? What does he succumb?
Sure.
But then it goes down such a really weird rabbit hole where somebody else gets vampirized, and there's like a bunch of thugs that get murdered, and it just spirals so weirdly out of control to the point where there's even a giant-ass time jump in between the events of the first few manga, I think, towards the events of the last ones. And again, terrible abuse and violence. And unlike with Nijigahara Photograph, this is graphic. This is just terrible. And I just like the idea of vampires. But towards the middle, I'm just like, why are we here now? And I'm just like, all right, just tell me what happens next. Unlike with Flowers of Evil, what you see is not what you get. You get taken for a huge crazy loop, and towards the end of it, I don't know that you feel good afterwards. There's just too much that has happened that is very disturbing to make it feel like it resolved nicely, even if there is some nice resolution towards the end. It's like, and suddenly everything's fine. No, it's not. I certainly wasn't. So read at your own sort of like, if it's not your kind of company, just stay away from it. But there's morbid curiosity, I think, is the only thing that got me through towards the end, because you just have to, like, I got attached to the characters. I gotta know what the heck happens to these schmucks. And I found out, and I guess it turned out okay for them, maybe, if that's, like at least some kind of a spoilery like caveat. But is it though okay? You be the judge if you even want to give it a shot. So that's my little soapbox rant.
The next book I'm going to talk about is a classic read this time.
Here we are.
And it is A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. This is the story of Lucy Honeycomb. She's on vacation with, I think it's like a chaperone or her grandmother.
Right, yeah.
She's in Italy, and then they cross paths with a grandson and his grandfather who or is it grandson and grandfather, or is it like son and father? It's one or the other. So they cross paths with people in Italy, and there's an incident that occurs between Lucy and the son. Then it jumps, I guess, a year later to when Lucy is engaged to someone else, but she still finds herself thinking of like the incident in Italy that one summer. And it was fun for what it was. I actually ended up listening to this on audio as well, and it was entertaining. I don't think it was quite what I expected it to be, which is an odd thing to say because it's pretty straightforward and the summary does not leave much room for like adding anything extra to it. Yeah. I do appreciate that there was like an over-exaggeration in the characters where they all felt sort of like caricatures in a way where it appealed to me. Not too much over the top, but in a way that made sense in my brain. Yeah. And the story itself was okay. It's very slice of life. It's very like of its time, where like an incident with someone could cause like a kerfluffle with everyone else, and that could be a problem. And it's a secret that everyone's trying to hide. But what if you can't hide it because you're crossing paths again? Like, it's this whole thing. Totally. And it made sense for the time being. I think I just had very high expectations for it, and I was hoping to really love it, but I didn't love it as much as I'd like, even though I enjoyed it, if that makes any sense. So, do I think it's worth reading? Sure. I think like it's one of those things where it's an easy classic to devour. It's shorter than a lot of the others, and the setting and the whole setup kind of make it fun, especially if you're into the stories where it's more slice of life, slightly romanticized classics, but it's not necessarily one of my favorite adult classics yet. I've yet to find a lot of adult classics that appeal to me, because most of my favorites are, you know, children's classics. Yeah. Here's to hoping I find one in the future. It's How to Stop Time by Matt Haig. This is about a man named Tom Hazard, and he is basically settling back in London into an ordinary teacher's life, except that Tom is not an ordinary person because he's actually been alive for centuries. He is part of this society called the Albatross Society, and really the only rule is that you can't fall in love and you can't expose yourself, because people might want to experiment on you, because if you can live for that long, you might be able to contribute to, I don't know, medicine,
sure,
health,
yeah,
immortality, you know, the usual. Tom does end up developing feelings for someone, and it kind of sends him down a rabbit hole of trying to really figure out what he wants to do and like how to extricate himself from the society is basically what it is. I like this one. I didn't necessarily love it as much as I anticipated, but I do think the concept is utterly fascinating, because the way that the immortality part of it is handled is interesting. Ooh. We get to see both Tom in the present day after years and years and years of being alive and having to change identities and having to like escape from people and having to keep the secret and having to keep, you know, have relationships knowing that they're going to be temporary. We also get to actually see all of his, you know, all of those important parts of his past too, because it does jump in timeline from the present day to the past. It's a fascinating mix of things, and it really makes you question, like, would you want to have the same gift that Tom and others of his kind have? What would it mean for you if you did? Is there a way for you to sort of, you know, be able to be present and to enjoy life even though you've lost so many things over and over and over again? So thematically, I feel like the way that it grappled with all of that stuff was really interesting, but the storytelling is pretty much the same as it was in the Midnight Library, where it's quick and snappy and it's very readable, but at the same time it doesn't really allow for the reader to get super invested in the characters of the story, especially Tom himself, who one would hope you'd get invested in because he's the main narrator of the story. Still, I thought it was just an interesting thing to like devour. It was a very quick read, honestly. So if you're looking for something that's more like a quick, readable sort of story that might have you, I don't know, reflecting on your own life and the possibilities of what an immortal life might mean, then you might want to check this out. But in terms of, is it a new favorite? Likely not. Ha. The last book that I'm going to talk about in this video is one that is very, very popular. And while I did enjoy it, I don't think I loved it as much as so many other people do. And that book is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is basically the story of Achilles, but told from the point of view of Patroclus. Which, that in itself was already enough to make me want to read it, because I love, it's almost like retellings of any story, really. I like seeing an alternate take on what might have actually happened, you know, because you'll never really know, right? These are all totally like fictional things that none of us really know the truth of. And it was fascinating to me that Madeline Miller chose Patroclus as her narrator, because it gives you a different look at what Achilles is like. You see him as the warrior, sure, but you also see him growing up in the story. You get to see a side of him that's more private than the rest of the story, I guess, like the whole warrior, I'm the golden boy warrior of the of the Greeks. You get to see another side to him, and I appreciated that. And I also appreciated seeing Patroclus as a bigger character in the story versus just someone who was around Achilles, you know.
Totally.
That was definitely interesting for me. And as always, well, and as I previously experienced with her other novel, Circe, the writing in this one is just really readable. It gives you enough description to make it feel like it's part of the mythological canon, I guess is what I want to say. But at the same time, there's enough to it that makes it feel modern and also easy to read.
Fair.
I should say. I wasn't as big a fan of like the time jumps in this one, because I feel like that's always a hard thing for me in the stories I read, and it's very rarely done in a way where I really appreciate it, but I can see why she did it in this story. So there's that at least. I would say that I am still very interested in reading more stuff from Madeline Miller. I just like her take on, you know, these figures from Greek mythology. I think she does an interesting things with them. She did it with Circe, she did it here in the Song of Achilles, so I'm looking forward to reading anything she has coming out that will also do that. Would I say that I love this one as much as the collective internet book community seems to. Probably not. Yeah. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that I read Circe first. I feel like my feelings might have been slightly different if I had read this one first and then Circe, but we'll never know now. So would I suggest checking it out? Yes, it is something that I think you'll find pretty compelling, and the fact that both of my sisters and my cousin, we all read it and we all liked it, I think that's a pretty telling thing because our tastes are very divergent in a lot of ways. So I think it's worth checking out. I can't pronounce it as a new favorite, but I know a lot of other people have.
Alrighty then.
Alright, those are all the books we're talking about in this week's What We Read. If you've read any of them, have any thoughts, feel free to leave a comment down below. All our social media links are there as well for you to check out, and we will see you guys with a new video next week. Bye! Bye.